Well, thank you so much for coming out for this. This is the second time I presented this work, and I'll caveat a little that we are about 2/3 done with our data collection. So there's a few slides at the end that I'll talk through. They'll say, but ongoing. So I'm at the point in my research where I can actually deal with constructive criticism. I also want to highlight that this project is conducted with two other individuals who are not here, so if they're listening, Ben Schechter and Rachel Schaefer at the Naval War College. So, obligatory cyber-nuclear beginning. And for those of you who were alive in the 80s, I was, and there was a really wonderful movie with Matthew Broderick. And Matthew Broderick was an engineering young student who happened upon Strategic Command's nuclear planning through a computer game. And so this Shall We Play a Game was part of WarGames, the movie, which first highlighted the role that cyber vulnerabilities and the increasingly digitized nuclear arsenal might play in nuclear stability dynamics. Now, what's interesting about this movie is that Ronald Reagan saw it. And after seeing the movie, he said, oh, shoot, could this happen in real life? And most things that you see from Hollywood, you go and look, can it happen in real life? And you go, oh, thank God, no. But in this case, they did an analysis and they found, oh, actually, there are some real vulnerabilities that are occurring in our nuclear arsenal. So it actually spearheaded the first kind of cyber vulnerability penetration testing, which is not what they called it back then. But the relationship between cyber vulnerabilities and nuclear stability has continued even since the 80s. So the first real advent of a cyber physical destruction cyber attack was Stuxnet. And Stuxnet was a cyber attack that targeted the development of nuclear weapons in Iran. But there have also been New York Times reports that the United States has used cyber attacks to slow down the development of North Korean ballistic missiles. And there continue to be discussions about supply chain vulnerabilities for the nuclear arsenal today. So cyber and nuclear are still intermingled in a way that we haven't figured out since we first identified the problem back in the 80s. And it's becoming especially pertinent today. So here are some of the kind of the policy directives that have come out in the last few years that have explicitly tied cyber vulnerabilities to nuclear stability. And I want to really highlight both the National Defense Strategy, which talks about the modernization of the nuclear triad, which really in a lot of ways means the complete digitization of the nuclear triad. And then the Nuclear Posture Review, which talked about updating the aging NC3 system. And we found in other studies, both conducted in the Navy and then Chatham House, that these vulnerabilities, these cyber vulnerabilities, are a continued problem. And we haven't figured out the real role that these cyber vulnerabilities will play in nuclear stability dynamics. So that brings me to the research question that motivated this research, which is how do cyber threats to nuclear command, control, and communications, henceforth NC3, or I will never finish this presentation, how do they affect international stability? So I'm going to look very specifically at how perceptions of vulnerability impact decisions to use nuclear weapons. I want to look at what drives decisions to use NC3 exploits. And then in terms of policy recommendations, what does this mean for nuclear force modernization, allocation, and doctrine? And then finally, what does this mean for cyber strategy? So I'm going to talk a little bit about NC3. Now, there are some real experts in this room, so some of it's going to be kind of things you already know, but it's sometimes important to understand why we're talking about cyber in reference to NC3 and why changes in technology matter for NC3 technology development as well as doctrine. So what is NC3? And you'll see that NC3 is actually a change in the acronym. So this slide, I think, is from like the mid-2000s when they were calling the NC3 the NMCS. So there have been a series of different acronyms to talk about what is the sensors, the communication relays, the satellites, the weapons platforms, the intelligence processing centers in which all this information comes in. All of these different types of technologies and ways to command and control and to gain warning about nuclear attacks, this is all the NC3. And the NC3 has evolved over time. And that's really important for how we think about cyber vulnerabilities. And when the NC3 first stood up, the most important thing was that we really only had one nuclear state. So we didn't have to worry about second forces, about surviving a first strike. And these sensors that were required to survive a second strike, there just weren't very many of them. So as the NC3 evolved, we saw different changes in the development of sensors. So satellites went up. We saw the nuclear triad emerge. So instead of it just being something that was delivered via aircraft, we now had to communicate with submarines. We had to communicate with ballistic missiles. And those are very different types of communication mechanisms. And we also saw doctrine changes. So we went from a pre-Soviet nuclear weapons development where we really only had to worry about the command and control of our own forces to thinking about how we would survive after a nuclear strike by the Soviets. And that went from massive retaliation, where we really just had to control the weapons once, to flexible response, which meant we had to be able to survive an initial nuclear attack and then be able to use different types of nuclear weapons in different ways, which required an NC3 that was much more flexible and that could survive an initial nuclear attack. And then the move to global strike now. And what's significant about the move to global strike is that it also features the entanglement of conventional command and control mechanisms with nuclear command and control mechanisms. So we see that as the needs of the NC3 changed, so also did the structures and therefore the vulnerabilities of NC3. And I think there's a really nice image here. I want to say this is in the Blair book, which kind of shows the way networks have changed as we've seen changes in doctrine and changes in technology. So it goes from a central vulnerability to decentralized vulnerabilities, but still relatively centralized nodes, to what would be kind of more accurate to what we see today, which is these very complex networks in which there are not maybe centralized vulnerabilities, but there are vulnerabilities that may have unknown cascading effects. And the way in which the development of these networks and the migration of the networks from very centralized to much more complex systems really changes the way in which vulnerabilities affect overall stability dynamics. So what does the literature say about how threats to the NC3 affect nuclear stability? Well, most of this work really peaked in like the late 80s, early 90s. So a lot of the work done by Ashton Carter and Desmond Ball. So Ashton Carter introduces this idea of asymmetric vulnerability, in which states may feel that they are so vulnerable to attack within their NC3 that they're forced to conduct a preemptive strike. Also, threats to NC3 affect the actual control of nuclear forces. So not just desire for preemption, but also the ability to conduct a relatively controlled nuclear war. And then, all through this, there's discussions about the ways in which perceptions of these vulnerabilities would affect the overall stability dynamics, and whether mutual vulnerabilities within the NC3 or dominance of NC3 could affect decisions to use nuclear weapons earlier in a conflict. So what do we know about cyber and nuclear stability? Well, I'm going to speak really quickly about just cyberspace and escalation. So in general, inside the cyber literature, there are three ideas about cyber and escalation. One is that cyber is an escalating force, and this is the idea that there is an offense-defense balance, and cyber is inherently offensive, and therefore it increases the chance of instability. The second is cyber as a de-escalating force, which is that cyber provides options that increase and expand the bargaining space prior to war, and that entanglement actually can be used to deter further instability dynamics. And then finally, there's a set of literature that suggests that cyber actually just has little impact. And this is either because it doesn't create enough physical effects or enough cognitive effects to impact the kind of larger decisions about the use of nuclear weapons or conventional weapons. Now, most of the literature when it came out was cyber is escalating. But as we've turned to more empirical work, we've actually found very little evidence for cyber as an escalating. And so the vast majority, I would say the null hypothesis of the cyber empirical work is that cyber actually can be either a destabilizing or null impact in instability dynamics. So that leads us to cyber and thermonuclear war, which we have very similar kind of theories about its destabilizing or stabilizing incentives. And I'm going to skip those and go straight to what we're going to look at, which is whether cyber vulnerabilities are escalatory or stabilizing. the predominant, I think, hypothesis would be for escalatory is that there are windows of vulnerability. And when states feel that they are asymmetrically vulnerable to attacks on their NC3, this would lead them towards preemptive strikes. But on the other hand, there are two potential stabilizing hypotheses. Mutual vulnerability, in which both states don't believe that they can control their forces and they therefore restrain themselves, or kind of one of taking from the cyber hypotheses that there's an expanded bargaining space, that this allows states to interact with each other in a way that actually decreases incentives or pressures to use nuclear weapons. And finally, kind of a minimal effect hypothesis. Hey, y'all, nobody believes in these things anyway, so they just don't matter to decisions. I kind of have a secondary dependent variable in here, which is the use of the cyber exploit or attacks against NC3. And here we really have conflicting ideas about whether these exploits are going to be used in conflict. And so this game actually gets at also whether there are incentives to use these cyber exploits. All right, so why war games? War games, what makes war games different than anything else? Well, are they experiments? Sometimes they are. Stacey Pettyjohn has some of the best work on what a war game really is, which is that they're events which are played by human beings. They're bound by a set of rules in which individuals make decisions and deal with the consequences of their actions. So sometimes these are board games, sometimes these are computer games, sometimes these are people sitting around a table. So it doesn't matter as much the way in which they're conducted, it's that they feel like they're playing a game. Every war game has a few essential elements. Players. So if you're running a Monte Carlo, that's not a war game, that's a computer-based simulation. Rule sets, so how to play the game. What are the bounds of the actions that you can take in the game? A scenario, and then data collection is a feature of analytic war games, but it's not a feature of all war games. War games have a long and storied history with nuclear planning. I'm going to skip this slide because I think Reed, and if anybody wants to know about this, Reed is actually the expert on it, but he's done a lot of great work documenting the way in which war games and nuclear weapons and the development of nuclear doctrine are related to each other. So why wargaming is a research method? Why not just conduct another survey experiment? Well, or conduct a large N data analysis. Well, war games are especially useful for questions that have very little empirical precedent. So there's either no data, which is the case of the question I'm looking at, or there's really bad data, which is often the question when you look about some of the cyber stuff that's more classified. And they're also really good for questions that have behavioral hypotheses, because in general, games are about human interactions. They're good to understand group decision-making, and we'll talk more about the role of the group in my game. And there's a real question about whether these might be more externally valid and represent decision-making more accurately than lab or survey experiments. Most games are not designed as an experiment, but I'm going to present you a game that I designed using quasi-experimental methods. So the pro there is I can iterate. I have more internal validity, but there are some potential cons, including player buy-in. And we can talk more about the decisions about designing war games in the Q&A. So I'm going to talk specifically about my game design. So in my game design, there are 4 total groups. Then the players are randomly assigned to one of these 4 groups. There's only a few differences between these games, and that's whether there is a vulnerability in their nuclear command and control, or whether there's an access and exploit. So we have a control group that has no vulnerability, no exploit. We have a full treatment group that has both a vulnerability and an exploit, and then we have 2 asymmetric groups. We have a vulnerability, no exploit, exploit, no vulnerability. We developed two scenarios. One is a lower intensity scenario, which is a land grab scenario. And the second, we really dial up and put them right at the brink of nuclear war, where forces are already at nuclear alert. It's a one-move, single-sided game, which allows me to control for internal validity and allows me to do a lot of iteration. But it does kind of weigh some problems with player buy-in and external validity. So I'd love to talk more about decisions to include, for instance, a red team, or to run games with multiple sets, multiple moves. All right, so here's where we are on sample. So the goal for the sample is 500 players. We're currently at 310. And that's about 62% American, 38% non-American. We have a predominantly male sample, but to be honest, that's probably indicative of where the national security demographics are, unfortunately. Most of our players are older, so we only have 11% that are under 30. That represents our desire to try and get as close to expert players as possible. But I'd like to talk more about what expertise is as we go through these slides. So we've played this now over the last year and a half in 9 locations. Some of them have been at the back of track 2s. There was one, in Thailand on the back of a track 2 between Indians and Pakistanis. We've run some at Naval War College, at Harvard. We've run them in Norway and Argentina, and they're all slightly different samples each time. So sometimes you're getting samples that are predominantly military. Sometimes you're getting really high diplomats. Sometimes you're getting mid-level, research associates at different think tanks. So you have a wide variety of expertise here. So of our individuals, 15% identify themselves as either a cyber policy or cyber technical expert. We have 21% that identify themselves as nuclear policy or nuclear technical expert. And that's somewhat important because we ran a game, for example, at Sandia where we had bunches of nuclear engineers, and they actually view the problem differently than those who are nuclear policy experts. And you see the same with the cyber. Cyber technical experts have come to it with a different set of decision-making beliefs than those who are cyber policy experts. We so far have about 85% that would identify themselves as mid or senior level experts. So this is a real attempt for us to try and find expertise. So the general situation, we present them with a very hypothetical situation of our state versus other states. And so the gray region is a semi-autonomous region within our state. And what happens in this scenario is other state induces a kind of a revolution in gray region and invades gray region and takes it over. So it has hints of Crimea, hints of Kashmir. There's sometimes a Korea reference. We actually ask people if they visualize any particular scenario. But we thought we were creating a really high intensity scenario. And we ran it 12 times, and Americans just this didn't resonate with them as a high intensity scenario. And they didn't emotionally understand the saliency of gray region. So we decided, well, let's push it up a notch because we're really interested in nuclear weapons. And then we developed a second scenario, which players play after scenario 1, in which other state actually invades our state and puts their forces on nuclear alert and completely takes control over the gray region. So the idea here was, okay, if you didn't think the first one was high enough intensity, now I'm really forcing you to think about the role of nuclear stability dynamics. We introduce a treatment once the players have been briefed their scenario inside their groups. So this is the treatment about the NC3 exploit, where we tell them that they have an exploit to attack the other state's NC3 and that it has a high probability of success. If they got a vulnerability, we also do something which is pretty much symmetrical, where we say that the other state has an exploit or access against our state's NC3. Interesting, this bullet down here, we said that it was unclear how to mitigate the NC3 vulnerability. Basically telling them you can't patch it, but our players invariably say they can patch it, which is really interesting because they generally believe the exploit, that they will be successful at the exploit, but they disbelieve their vulnerability. And this is something that we give them to tell them that they don't have an access and also that they don't have a vulnerability. So this is what we would give, for example, to our control group. So in terms of data collection, we have 2 ends. One is the response plan, which is the game. That's the outcome variable. And then we do individual level surveys. So we have 2 ends. We have the end of the game and the end of the players. And the players is where we capture individual behaviors and motivations and differences in opinion within the group. It's also how we explore variables that are not overtly written in the scenario and identify group differences. And then we've also tried to use facilitator and plenary notes in order to get at kind of the squishy about interaction that maybe we haven't captured in surveys. But this is kind of spotty at best. So it's interesting to talk about data collection and how you do that in WarGames. So here's an example of our response plan. So we've given them a series of response actions that they can choose. We ask them to describe their plan and what they think their course of action is going to be. And this allows us to both have a quantitative measurement of outcome, but also a qualitative understanding of what they're trying to get at with the outcomes. So that allows us to kind of banter them against each other. All right, so I'm going to present the initial data. So this is the initial data from the first 62 iterations of this game, which is 310 players. So this is the data that we have collected for scenario 1. And I think the most important thing to see is that in scenario 1, nobody chose nuclear attack, which is great. So the cyber vulnerabilities in scenario 1, we see no relationship with that and decisions to use nuclear weapons. But what is kind of interesting is nuclear alert. And because the two bar graphs there that show the highest probability of going to nuclear alert are the ones that are the games in which the players had the exploit. So we actually would have expected that vulnerability would have increased the chances that they go on nuclear alert, but instead we see exploit. And we went back and checked that as soon as we started getting that data. We thought, this is counterintuitive, let's make sure we didn't mess this up. But so far it tracks out, and it's been consistent across the games as we continue to play them. The asymmetric group with an exploit, but not a vulnerability, is more likely to use the exploit than the group with the symmetric exploit and vulnerability, which I think is what we would kind of expect. And what's also interesting, that all groups that have played our game are more likely to use cyber, non-NC3 attack cybers than games that we've run in the past, which are kind of more pure cyber games. The most likely to use cyber was in the control. So when we told them that they didn't have any vulnerabilities or exploits in NC3, they are more likely to use cyber in general, which is interesting. So when we move to scenario 2, we do see some variation on nuclear attack, but good news, guys, it occurred only in a minority of the games. So still not a predominant response, but it was most likely in the games that had an exploit, but no vulnerability. And what's interesting is all the games that went to nuclear attack were games in which the groups had an exploit. So it seems right now, and these are still relatively low end for the total game outcomes, but it seems right now that it's more related to the exploit than the vulnerability. Almost all groups went to nuclear alert, irrespective of their cyber treatment. And what's really interesting is if you look at cyber attack NC3, the yellow bar and the gray bar, those are our groups where we explicitly told them that they do not have an exploit to use, but they wrote it in. So this is very fascinating because the desire to use the NC3 exploit is so strong that even when they were not given it, they wanted to use it. And I think that's really important for especially American policymakers when thinking about whether adversaries are going to try and exploit NC3 vulnerabilities. Our game suggests that most people will try and use that exploit. In general, the propensity to use different means in games, you see similarities across scenario 1 and scenario 2. And I think this kind of gives us some sort of indication about what players believe are lower escalatory or lower cost actions. So diplomacy, fortify defenses, economic punishment, conduct intelligence, info ops, soft operations, mobilize forces. So soft operations are put kind of in the lower cost earlier scenario category. But there are differences. So scenario 2, you're more likely to see the invasion of territory, conventional attacks, cyber attacks in general go up in scenario 2. So that represents that you're not seeing a lot of restraint in the cyber domain as we intensify the seriousness of the crisis. In the surveys, we asked the individuals, what role did having an NC3 vulnerability play in your response plan? So the blue categories here are the exploit vulnerability scenarios, and the gray are where they had no exploit, but they had a vulnerability. So in the exploit vulnerability, it led them to say that there was either no effect, the NC3 vulnerability had no effect, or it restrained nuclear use. And also maybe incentivize cyber use. It definitely incentivized cyber use in scenario 2. And we saw some slight incentivizations of nuclear use in the second scenario. For those who had no exploit but had a vulnerability, we noticed that having that vulnerability caused them to restrain their nuclear use, but had a mixed effect on kind of cyber use that was similar across scenario 1 and scenario 2. So both of these saw a slight increase in incentives for nuclear use in the second scenario, but we would expect that because we put them on the brink of nuclear war. Now, then we also asked them what role that having an NC3 exploit would play in their response plan. And this was really interesting. I want to highlight first that we had 160 players in scenario 2 that had an NC3 exploit, and 108 reported using the exploit. So that's a really high percentage of players that said that they were willing to use the NC3 exploit. And when we asked them why they chose to use the exploit, because we wanted to understand why they wanted to use it, their dominant response was that they desired to limit other states' ability to launch a nuclear attack. So this is really seen as a counterforce kind of weapon. But the next most popular response was that they used the NC3 exploit because it was the less escalatory option. So they really, I think, do view this as an increase in the bargaining space that may increase their chances to ward off nuclear before beginning. So for those who had the exploit and the vulnerability, we saw no effect or nuclear restraint with an increased incentive for cyber use in scenario 1. It significantly increased incentives for cyber use and increases in both restraint and, to a lesser extent, incentives for nuclear use for scenario 2. What's interesting is that the exploit seems to matter more than the vulnerability. This is something that keeps coming up. For those who had the exploit but no vulnerability, the most likely responses were that it restrained nuclear use, had no effect, and incentivized cyber use in scenario 1. And in scenario 2, we saw more incentives for restrained nuclear use. So this is the exploit causes them to restrain nuclear use, which is really fascinating. So it's been very surprising to us that we continue to find this effect where the exploit seems to affect people's decision-making more than the vulnerability would. So one variable that we didn't include in the scenario, but we thought was really important, was asymmetries of power. So in the game, we told them that they were strictly comparable across all domains of warfare. But we wanted to understand whether balance of power mattered. So we asked them a question in the survey about whether if the adversary was more capable or less capable, whether that would affect the use of means that they chose across the games. And across the games, and across the scenarios, less capable, more capable, any asymmetry increased the chance of cyber use, which I think is a really fascinating thing to think about when it comes to the potential for using cyber. But there were indications that kind of changes in conventional power or changes in power would kind of increase some of the deterrence effects and decrease some others. So I'm going to run through this really quickly. We think demographics matters, but we need to do a lot more work looking at and disaggregating the data. Nationality seems to matter in some way. Americans really didn't understand the saliency of the first scenario, which was really fascinating. They kept saying, we're here because we need to get the port back. And I had to have my co-authors, I was like, go back and find where we wrote anything about a port. I don't remember writing about a port. And we had one bullet in a player handbook. But all the American players have found this. But it's really interesting when you're thinking about how Americans contextualize the use of force and the motivations behind the use of force. We don't see that in the other nationalities. What's been fascinating is when we run this game in South America, where they don't have a long history of thinking about nuclear taboo or nuclear doctrine, we don't see them graft the same sort of ideas about nuclear restraint that we saw really in a lot of the Western players. So where beliefs come from and how that belief has been internalized within their society becomes really important, especially when we're talking about countries that may have cyber capabilities, but haven't spent the last 60 years thinking about nuclear doctrine or nuclear stability. Age we thought would be important, and it just hasn't been. And what has been more important is the type or quality of expertise. So we see somewhat different play coming out of those who have a nuclear policy background from those who have more of an economics background or those that have a cyber technical background. And that's something that we're going to be working on a lot more closely is what is expertise. So I'm working on a project right now with Sarah Krebs and Jonathan Renshaw where we're going to be comparing the expert population with undergraduates and see whether there is a significant difference between how they play the game and really looking at the heterogeneity of experts to see whether experts make significantly different decisions than those who would be considered like non-experts and what is an expert. All right, so concluding thoughts, my implications for policy. So what's fascinating about this is that I think the certainty about cyber vulnerabilities and the ability to not believe in cyber vulnerabilities matters because because of this willful disbelief about cyber vulnerabilities, there's little evidence in the games for deliberate escalation incentives or incentives for preemption. In fact, there's some evidence that the NC3 exploits actually decrease the incentives to use nuclear weapons in scenario 2. But what's interesting is it didn't seem to affect nuclear alert. So the inclusion of cyber exploits also increased the chances that the groups put their forces at nuclear alert. So what we may find is that while cyber vulnerabilities and exploits don't increase incentives for preemption, they may actually increase the chance of inadvertent escalation or accidental war. Finally, the nature of the network seems to matter in the way in which people believe in the certainty of their vulnerabilities. And the inability to conceptualize these vulnerabilities leads to a kind of disbelief that allows for more stability when it comes to deliberate escalation, but a lot less stability potentially when it comes to more inadvertent means for escalation to war. We're continuing to work on this, so we'll also be running survey experiments to see whether we find something significantly different in surveys than we do in WarGames and test the external validity question. And then something that I haven't discussed much at all here, but is the role of the group. So this was a group of 5 that simulated a national cabinet. And we do see some differences between how people would have played individually and how people play in a group. The group seems to bring everyone to the middle. And so it's really interesting. The group is kind of an intervening variable here. And then I focus on a really binary potential attack to nuclear command and control, which is you just can't control your forces. But the reality is the vast majority of cyber vulnerabilities and the NC3 is not going to be binary like that. Instead, it's going to be cyber vulnerabilities that affect sensors or that affect weapons platforms. And those potentially have a very different relationship than the hypothesis and the treatment that we concocted. And so that would be a really interesting implication to pursue in further games. So with that, I want to leave us a little bit of time for questions.
Great.
Thank you.
So as is our tradition, we'll go to our fellows first and do it.
Thank you, Jackie. In the evaluation of pre-doctoral fellows here, I actually have 2 quick questions. The first is really interested in your results on the difference between nationality, but I think you mentioned that you looked at the Indians and the Pakistanis and the Taiwanese. So was there variation between those groups in the United States, given that they're both nuclear, they both have nuclear capacity, but they're varying levels? And the second is, how much time was there between iterations, and how might timing and real-world outcomes, or real-world events, affect the different outcomes?
So on the India-Pakistan, so they were actually the first game that we ran, which you never want to do, like take this like amazing opportunity and run your game for the first time with them. So we ran them only with scenario 1, which I'm kind of sad about, because I think scenario 2 would have been a lot more interesting. They did have different saliencies when it came to scenario 1, so they were more likely to escalate in some of the conventional means, but they weren't, their nuclear dynamics, the choices that they made in terms of nuclear weapons were not different than Americans in that first scenario. But that first scenario was lower intensity. I wish I could go back and redo with scenario 2. And then the question about time is a really important question. And I think it's a really important question for people who are executing this kind of research design, because of the time it takes to execute it. The world is changing over the last year and a half. And that would cause me some significant problems if I noted that there were significant differences in play over that last year and a half. But so far, I'm not seeing significant differences in play. Now, what it does require me as a researcher to do is go through to each group and see whether there are differences in like the location that we played. Is that location, are they playing differently? Is our games that we played prior, are those outcomes looking different? We're not seeing significant differences right now. So I'm not saying longitudinal doesn't matter, but so far it hasn't seemed to matter for our results. But that's a really important question and something to think about as somebody who's designing these kind of events or research methods.
So I have Julian and Lauren in the queue.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I'm Julian, postdoc at CISAC. So in your game, what is extremely important in what you want to look at is the influence of exploit or vulnerabilities considering a cyber attack. So do you give, in your game, do you give the participants a detailed explanation of what are the impacts of the cyber attack in terms of like, does it delay just the launch of nuclear weapons? Does it just cancel half of the launch?
Good question.
Maybe I look at detail of this, but this is, I think, something really important to.
Yeah, we had a lot of debates about how much detail to give in the treatments. So this is where we give, first off, we give a definition of what NC3 is, because we do have a lot of varying expertise. But we try to give them, there are some uncertainties in this explanation of the effects that we really thought about. So for example, the exploit has a high probability of success. We actually tested on a very small group differences between different percentages, and then decided that almost nobody can give a high percentage, a particular percentage for a cyber attack anyway. So we went back to high probability, because if you anchor on a probability, it does affect people's choices in a way that's maybe not useful. But we told them that it cut off the other state's ability to launch nuclear attacks, but didn't create functional damage. So the idea was that it's not like it's going to be reversible. And we also told them that we didn't know how long it would work for. Time is important, and in the discussions about time came up a lot in decisions about the use of the exploit, though, as I showed you, they use the exploit a lot. And then we told them it was relatively covert, but attribution may be possible. And so we really thought through how much of this is somewhat realistic for the way cyber attacks do work. And then we chose to hit them on the head with some other stuff. Like this idea that it cut off the total ability to launch nuclear attacks. I don't think that's extraordinarily realistic with the vast majority of nuclear inventories out there. Any state that has a second strike capability has thought through pre-delegation. They have multiple means of communication. This really is in some ways me taking it and hitting them on top of the head with the exploit. And we made that choice because we really wanted the treatment to be very blunt in that way. And the vulnerability, we tried to be relatively symmetric with how we did that. So you can see this is almost the exact same as how it is on the other side. This is the only big difference, but they really do ignore this line. And it is shocking to me how many times I heard in groups or the facilitators wrote, they said they could patch it. But it actually jives with other research I've done with survey experiments or with other war games in which vulnerabilities are usually dismissed. And yet individuals often overestimate the success of their exploit.
Lauren, and then Shinra.
Okay, Julian, you stole my question. So maybe, would you mind elaborating on that last point a little more? Like, do you see, what is a way to see some of these experts kind of grapple with these vulnerabilities in a more realistic way?
That's one of the hardest parts about doing this kind of data collection is the richness of how people get to their decisions is the heart of data collection process. And ideally, I would hook everyone up to microphones and measure and get all the transcripts, but for a variety of reasons, it's not feasible. So we, yeah, I know, right? That's a great idea. Yeah. So we've had to rely on two methods to understand the way they grapple with these questions. One is facilitators. So in a lot of, in some of the iterations we've run, we've actually had a facilitator for each small group, and that facilitator takes notes as the things happening. Now it's inconsistent among facilitators, right? And what facilitators are more interested in, they're more likely to write notes about. And the other way that we've tried to grapple with this is through plenaries. So at the end of the game, everyone convenes and we have kind of a facilitated discussion. So this is, you know, these are mostly qualitative kind of, and they're qualitative observations that we've taken. And I would love for future games, I mean, if we had like more technology, we could do a better job of being able to catch the richness of the game that helps explain the motivations, which is the most interesting part of the games.
Two-finger on that, and then we have a couple other fellows. So if I understood you right, the vulnerability didn't seem to matter in the way that, say, some IR scholars would think in terms of driving preemption or escalation. but in part, it suggests because people didn't actually believe they were vulnerable,
Yeah.
right? So it's not that
Yeah.
vulnerability didn't matter, it's that people didn't believe they
Yeah.
were vulnerable. I wonder,
That's true.
did you think about engineering the game to make vulnerability revealed as opposed to just some intelligence person coming and saying, we have a vulnerability,
Yeah.
versus like, the system is down, right?
Yeah.
Like, and whether that would have changed behavior?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't expect this when we went into the game, which I should have, because my previous research, so I've researched with Sarah Krebs on, there's a survey experiment that looks at how people think about retaliation, Spock knows about this, in cyber versus conventional or nuclear, and we find like a really strong difference between cyber and the other domains, indicating that there is some sort of like firebreak or cognitive dissonance between attacks that occur in the cyberspace versus in other domains. So we had found that before. And then I have another paper where we looked at WarGames that were conducted by Stratcom, and we found similar disbelief in vulnerabilities. So I should have known that this was gonna happen because I'd seen it happen before, but I really believed in my IR theory. And so I wanted it, I didn't think I had to hit them on the head with it. But that's actually something I'm really interested in, is how salient the vulnerability has to be, or how concrete the vulnerability has to be to change people's behaviors. That's something I want to work on while I'm here, is using more experimental techniques to get at exactly that question.
Great. I have, Shinru and then Colin, the other Colin.
My name is Shinru. I'm a postdoc at CSAC. So my question is related with using wargaming as a research method, which is really inspiring. And because I'm very new to this, my question is, compared to like when you introduce the method and the result, you say like and there is like a experience compared to using the survey experiment. And then when you what I know about the survey experiment is there's a long-standing criticism that when people give out the survey experiment, the respondents are usually sitting in a room, answer questions, and the results will never like have the real-world impact.
Yeah.
So like when they make decisions, they probably will not think about those. Will not align with those in reality. So I'm wondering, when you use wargaming as a research method, do you experiment similar issue? Do you consider similar issue when using the wargaming as a method? And if yes, how could you mitigate it? And if not, why this is the case? And also because you have other projects that use survey experiments.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about if there any correlation between the findings using wargaming versus using the survey experiment, or is there any key difference in terms of results?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, and it's one that if anybody, this is something that Reed and I and Andrew Reddy and Eric Lynn Greenberg are all grappling with right now, because I think especially when Eric and I started doing WarGames, we just had this like embedded belief in ourselves that we thought games were more accurate representations of people's decision making, but we had no way to measure that, and we still haven't measured it. I'm going to be running this as a survey experiment as well. I'll tell you just what my gut is, and I don't have a way to prove this yet, but I want to test this. I think that in surveys, it's people's best answer. And I think in games, especially in games in which you have a group, people don't answer their best answer, right? When you put it in front of people as a scenario that they have to think through and deal with other individuals, I think they make less ideal. So I think we see a more realistic representation of bias in games than we do in surveys. But I'm not exactly sure. I can tell you that I know from my wargaming experience that I have players who have written about a thing, a policy prescription, and then they come in the games and they don't play their policy prescription, or they don't play the way that they advocate for in real life. And because of that, I think that that's what games provide. But this is something that we're actively interested in and that we want to test in order to see if there really is a difference. The other thing is that wargames are really expensive and they take a really long time. So if they're not better than survey experiments, then everyone should just do survey experiments, you know? So that's part of what we've been working on a little bit, is trying to understand the ways in which it is different and the types of questions that are better answered by games than surveys.
Okay, Colin and Deepak, and then we'll go to the others, starting with Paul. Go ahead.
Thanks for your talk. This is actually kind of related to the senior Collins earlier question. But,
Colin, semicolon.
Yeah. I thought the framing with, well, Ash Carter's on my mind. I met him yesterday. But asymmetric vulnerability as this phenomenon you laid out in the beginning, I wonder, do you see your conclusions having any thing to say about that being a valid concept or not? And could you modify the wargame to better reflect the asymmetry? Because it seemed like, at least in the, it looked pretty symmetrical in your game. And I don't know exactly how, but like, to better reflect the asymmetry, or is that really not what you're trying to test here? Was that just a framing device?
So I think when I'm talking about asymmetric vulnerability, I'm talking very specifically about asymmetric vulnerabilities in the MC3. So that's what I vary, is the asymmetry. So you have a vulnerability, the other one has an exploit, you have an exploit, the other one has a vulnerability. That's the asymmetry that I look at very specifically in this. But I'm fascinated in this idea of larger asymmetries, which is why we played with it, putting it actually in as a treatment, but it decreased our sample size so exponentially that we decided we're gonna have to run too many games, and that's why we put it in as a survey question. It's something I'd be interested in explaining more. But I think when it comes to asymmetric vulnerability and this hypothesis that perceptions of vulnerability create incentives for preemption, I think it goes back to what Colin was saying, which is the belief, and how strong that belief has to be in the vulnerability. And if you're a state or an individual that doesn't want to go to nuclear war, it's very easy to not believe in the vulnerabilities. So if that's your going in belief, the uncertainty around cyber vulnerabilities allow cognitive space to stick with that belief. Now, I will say in other research I've done, the only time where I find cyber vulnerabilities to be extraordinarily escalatory are individuals that have high, that are not cognitively complex, and can create certainty very easily in areas where there is uncertainty. And individuals who are able to create certainty, false certainty about threat, we see cyber vulnerability have an exponentially different effect, where they, as you say in the military, you go high and right, you go big early, and that's where you do see examples of preemption. So in research I've done in the past, I've suggested that the individual personalities of decision makers, especially in very centralized decision making like this, is actually really important. So 5 out of 6 times it's going to be good, but 6 out of 6 you get the individual that creates certainty in uncertainty, false certainty, and that person, you might get a very different outcome.
So you're saying superpower command systems would probably not, in fact, feel the need to strike first because they do not believe in vulnerabilities 5 out of 6 times.
I'm saying that's what I'm finding so far.
Interesting. Okay.
But if we go to a highly centralized networks, which are more efficient and more resilient, but vulnerabilities are more obvious, we might find that that dynamic changes.
So in the queue, I have Paul, Danielle, and then Reed, because you raised your hand late.
Fair.
Paul. Yeah. Paul. Oh, sorry. D-Bach, I skipped over you. But not for any reason that you should take personally. But Paul, since you were talking, we'll go call him in D-Bach. All right, go ahead.
So Paul Edwards, I'm here at CTEC. I'm also director of SDS program. Fascinating talk. I want to follow up on the port.
Oh, yeah.
But maybe not in the way that you think, because what it suggests to me is that people are imagining actual situations that make sense to them.
Yeah.
So, the description of the threat and of the vulnerability and the exploit are both quite abstract. And what I'm wondering is, did they develop more concrete, mental models of what they were thinking of when they were talking about those concepts in the groups?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We do ask in the survey whether they think of a specific country when they're playing the game, and it's interesting how often people do reference a country, but it's not consistent for one, which is good for us because it means it's not the same bias across. But this idea that they're able to visualize a scenario, but there hasn't been precedent of a cyber scenario that fits, is something that is a limitation of doing this kind of work. And we're trying to cut through that abstraction as much as possible and find ways to make it concrete and salient in a way that would be similar to the real life. But it's not perfect. And that actually is one of the next stages of research that I want to do. Is there are some, this has been a problem for all cyber research, by the way. But there's this great, like, Grey's Anatomy, where there's a ransomware attack on a hospital and people are dying, and it's very dramatic, right? Dramatic in a way that cyber usually is not. And so I want to run a study where I give somebody a scenario where they just read basically the plot of the Grey's Anatomy, and one in where they watch it and see if the visualization of it increases the belief in it in a way that, like, significantly changes the actions that they're willing to take. So that would be like a next stage for us.
Yeah, just one follow-up, especially on the vulnerability, what it made me think of is, sometimes I have to admit this, I binge watch terrible cop shows, and they're full of these characters who are hackers, and type very fast, and patch it, as you said.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, to what degree that kind of stock character idea, these things can be analyzed and addressed really, really fast.
But to be fair, I think these are the actual biases that real life decision makers bring to their decisions, because unfortunately, and you would know this, this is probably what an Intel update on cyber would look like. So this may be more technical, maybe worse. So in some, but I do think that those beliefs are the beliefs that people are bringing to my game. And those beliefs are representative in a lot of ways of the beliefs that they're bringing to the actual decisions that they would make in real life.
So I have a two-finger from David Elliott, but you should consider on the TV shows, doing a Mr. Robot treatment where one time it's real and the other time it's an hallucination. And David Elliott, you had a two-finger, and then we'll get back in the queue with Deepak and then go to Danielle. Go ahead.
I was wondering if you've ever considered precursor, what the precursor situation is. For example, very likely there's been combat and tactical use of nuclear weapons that lead up to the question of strategic use.
Yeah.
And we would have learned during that period whether or not the adversary, has a capability or an intention of interfering in the command and control at the tactical level, and that would change the thinking of what the vulnerabilities are for the strategic forces.
Yeah, and that's really, I think it's a really good point. We did not provide them detail about whether these were tactical or strategic. But
said strategic.
Well, yeah, so we give the assumption that they're strategic. I will say the only people who have asked questions about that are the nuclear policy experts. It's kind of fascinating. They also, the nuclear policy experts are also the only ones who in games have asked questions about pre-delegation of authority to different weapon systems. So they bring a different kind of knowledge into the game, which I think is important. I do think that they're, especially when we're talking about the importance of low-yield weapons, of low-yield nuclear weapons to nuclear stability, and the relevance today considering the nuclear posture review. I think Andrew Reddy is working on a use of wargaming to try and understand that, but I think that that's actually a really great thing for another game to look at, is if you included distinctions between tactical and strategic or low yield, if that would influence the decision making and the overall outcomes of the game.
Deepak and then Daniel. Go ahead.
So Deepak MacArthur, nuclear security pre-doctoral fellow here. Thanks for an excellent talk, Jackie. So I have two questions. And actually a thought on the port thing. I think if you have space, I'm wondering if this is true on the population that you see. If you're not actually from the US, you're more likely to not think of it as a port because you probably are looking at states or people from states which have fought wars and have neighbors who may attack them directly and or have nuclear weapons. And I'm thinking of India, for example, right? Like, so that may be a
definitely.
Right? So two questions. One is there a non-cyber exploit in the sense that is there a similar next best option that is not cyber which would get to some of these effects that you're talking about that the decision makers are sort of weighing against when they're choosing whether to do this cyber exploit versus not? So that's the question that I had, because I think that would have some kinds of implications. If there wasn't at all, then they may be more geared towards this.
So we don't give it explicitly, but they do have SOF. And there's info ops, and there's some options if they want to get creative to do that. And to be fair, we haven't mined the qualitative data yet. So when we mine the qualitative data, that's something that we'll definitely need to keep an eye out for, is whether they're trying to impact the NC3 through other means. So that's really helpful. And then the port, you're absolutely correct. Americans are the ones that don't understand the saliency of geographic conflicts or territory. So they kept saying, I don't understand why we would fight over the gray region. Why don't we just give it to the other state? And I was like, at one point I said, what if it was Texas? And they said, well, Texas would be different. I was like, but that's what I was doing. But I mean, to me, that's really fascinating, because it really reveals the way context and nationality plays into decisions about crisis dynamics. The Americans just couldn't get it. Oh, I know. Well, there's a whole nother conversation that we could have about maps and the decisions that we make about the proportions of maps, whether they are proportional, how big the icons are, whether we should even give people maps, whether they should be more realistic, more abstract. And there's like tons of questions that if I was doing a survey experiment, there's literature about the words in which we use, but there's no literature. There's been wargaming for the last 50, 60 years, and there's no literature about how these different choices affect the overall validity of the results that you get out of the game. So hopefully we're leading a community that's trying to work on some of these issues so that it can become a more rigorous research method.
Danielle, and then Reed.
I have a small cue, which is if there was anything novel about second strike capability in the control group in this study that you haven't seen before. And the other question I have is back to this specificity about vulnerabilities debate, and looking at nation-state capabilities versus actually mapping out the vulnerabilities in an NC3 system. I worked on that Chatham House report, and I can tell you this under Chatham House rules, there was a woman who's a hacker from Control Risks screaming in the lobby of the Mayfair at somebody we all know very well from the Congressional Research Service about, yes, I can hack your news. And she said, no, you can't. The systems are different. And they went back and they went forth. And we went to dinner and they went back and they went forth. And so that divide over NTI did the work that looked at nation state capabilities and what they could really do in this field. And they got a little ways down the road, but then they hit the classification barrier. And when we worked on the Chatham House report, we tried to do bottom up, like how do you map out the actual vulnerabilities? The systems are so different. So in this game, somebody thinks cyber and they think like a DNS domain server attack on your Alexa. But getting up that rung to understanding those systems. And so my question is, which one do you think is more salient, understanding a nation state capability and their profile of, attribution or not, which is a political decision, whatever. Do you think that's more important for these games, or a basic understanding of that bottom up vulnerability exploitation world that's very different from nuclear?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely abstracted out the technical, whether it could technically be accomplished. But I will tell you, so I'm a senior advisor on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and we wrote an entire recommendation about building a hunt team to map network vulnerabilities within the NC3, because in the unclass interviews we could do, nobody knew. So the good thing is, I don't know if I'm right or wrong on the vulnerability that I have up here, but this belief, and whether you believe it or not, is really important. And one of the things that we want to do a more granular look at is whether cyber technical experts are more are more likely to believe the vulnerability, right? Or less likely to believe the vulnerability, and whether that affects the decisions. Because we see we see exaggeration of both threat and vulnerability with different populations. So it's interesting. We're going to be running this game at Stanford in the winter. And so part of the idea of running at Stanford is to invite a lot of people from the technical community so that we can get a better sampling of what the technical community, what their input would be. And then the control group, it hasn't been in Second Strike. The big difference in the control group is like their incentives to use cyber. And they're more likely to use non-NC3 cyber attacks than the other groups, which I think just shows that if they don't feel like cyber is escalatory, they're more likely to use cyber. I don't know.
You did have up on your slide a reference to the 2018 nuclear posture review, and if the insider folks weren't worried about this, it's hard to believe U.S. declaratory policy would threaten nuclear retaliation for people who touch our NC3 systems. Like, there's clearly at least some people are worried about this, I think.
Yeah.
Reed.
Thanks, Jackie. As you know, I think this is fascinating and important work. A couple thoughts on the discussion that has been happening about survey experiments and what is the utility of WarGames. I kind of see this as the natural progression of what started when the first person ran the first comprehension check on the survey experiment to say, did they actually get what I was trying to treat them with? Let's check if they understood, if they read the paragraph I gave them. And then, you know, we got people that moved in the direction of using video treatments, right? And then we do have results that show that people have more emotional responses when they're shown videos. We also have people now, there's grad students who run virtual reality survey experiments, who like put their research subjects in the headset. This is just further down that road of attempted immersion. Now, all of that seems to be motivated from the instinct that more immersion is better. But what we need is the results to show, like, in what ways does it bias things because you've introduced strategic competition, right? And people actually, there's a ton of anecdotal evidence that suggests that it's useful, that people get in the room and they really want to win. And then at the extreme, the value is that people forget they are being studied. You hope, and Schelling claims, but we don't have the data to prove, that the people he was putting in his WarGames forgot that they were in the basement of the Pentagon being watched by him and his researchers. And so it's a little bit like the Heisenbergian problem of what data can I get out without affecting the sample. Right? So we need to prove that is in fact true, if it is true, and then the field can take it from there. All of that, I think, leads to a question that we've danced around, but I want to hear your more specific thinking about, and that's the trade-off of hypothetical versus real crises.
Good question. Yeah.
So all of the crises that I look at in the archives are quite real scenarios about, like, we are engaged in a war in Vietnam. Let's imagine now that the Chinese mobilize and are on the border. What do we do now? But it's really based in the real world. So when you are designing a game, what are the trade-offs you have in mind between our state versus the United States?
Yeah, so for us, we decided to do hypothetical because we knew we wanted an international sample. And we knew that cyber is something that people tend to overclassify, and nuclear is something that people tend to overclassify. And so we wanted to design a scenario in which we could be comfortable presenting it at a track 2 as much as, so it was, we want to be able to attract participants. And government participants are not, they don't like playing very realistic unclassified games. So in fact, I've run unclassified games that are then classified afterwards because so that's why we chose unclassified. Chose hypothetical. And there is some research, as you know, in survey experiments about the differences between hypothetical scenarios and real scenarios. It's also why we asked the question about whether people were envisioning a real scenario. We're running probably another 250 to 300 of these, and that's something that Sarah, Jonathan, and I are working on, is trying to find a measurement, a way to measure in the game whether people are more or less bought into it. and whether they're playing it like a game or playing it like they would actually make decisions. My hope is that what I'm collecting is maybe not how a state would react in real life, because there's a whole set of other variables that are not included in this game, which is bureaucratic dynamics, domestic politics, that I don't include in the game. But I want to understand my core for this is human behaviors. And for me, because this is about human behaviors and not how you would behave in one particular instance, that's why I'm more interested in a hypothetical. And it's also why large in, iteration, and generalizability in this game was focused on at the expense of realism, of potentially some buy-in as well.
Scott, and then Lynn Eden, and then Asfandia.
Jackie, you talked about the effects of gender and age on the findings, but you asked the other kinds of things that I know I'd be very interested in is, are the differences between people who believe in the death penalty as being appropriate for murderers versus those who do not? Do you have any measures to see whether people believe in proportionality, not in the legal sense, but in a sort of tit for tat? That is, they do a cyber attack on us, we have to do a cyber attack back in that general sense of the term. And then I think it's really creative to use nuclear learning activities as a measure. And here I'd want to find out how many people had a sense that nuclear learning activities are inherently risk-prone versus those who think, well, of course you do that because there's no risk involved because they haven't studied the history.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the nuclear alert thing is actually becoming, because we have so little variation in nuclear attack, nuclear alert's becoming a more interesting outcome variable for us. So one of the things that we're going to look at when we are more granular is how nuclear policy expertise affects the decisions to go to nuclear alert. Because my sense is that those who have the highest amount of nuclear policy expertise are going to be the least likely to go to nuclear alert. Because they understand the implications of that. So that's something we're going to be exploring in the when we finish the data collection. I wish I had the proportionality question. That's really that would have been very helpful to understand how some individual personality dynamics affect the decisions here. But we didn't think to add it. No, we actually. We have very few demographic questions in there because we have a time issue, obviously. So we cut a lot of that stuff, but I wish we had it. We don't have a lot of stuff on where people generate their beliefs from. But looking back, I wish we had it. Like I wish I had a question about like, do you know what the nuclear taboo is? You know, like a matching or something, because that also would help me delineate different types of expertise. Because some of these beliefs, we're finding some beliefs seem to be more or less important to how people view cyber and kind of where they're grafting their beliefs from. But we're having to collect that post hoc in facilitator notes, plenary notes, and qualitative data.
This is really interesting. I think this question is for you and maybe for Reed as well. You're talking here about games as social science for social science purposes. We know that in the beginning, games were for real leaders to sensitize them to what could happen. Although I don't know if presidents ever sat in, but the idea was to get people who really were in the government and to put them through this exercise. What do we know from those real games? And do you worry about the difference between doing this as social science and its very original, its origins?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. So I started in WarGames by working WarGames at the Naval War College for Strategic Command, for example. And so one of the papers that I have under review is 6 high-end crisis games that were run initially at the classified level, but that the cyber information was pulled out of it because it was deemed as not classified. A bunch of was sensitized. And in those games, I actually find very similar dynamics to what I'm finding here. That's helpful to me because it's coming from, that means that I've got people who are playing a game. The game that that I worked on previously took place over 5 to 6 days included people who really were top decision makers in these particular avenues. And they were given all the realism. I mean, it was messy data too. I mean, it sacrificed all sorts of internal validity. So because I've done that work, I am more confident about the fact that these games are representative of the decision-making that I would find in a messier, kind of more realistic, classified war game. But I definitely did make decisions about abstraction and internal validity in order to do something that has not been done with most of the war games that are conducted for the DoD, which is generalizability and iteration. So that was a conscious decision I made here. There is utility to realism and smaller end games that have more players. But in some ways, I think of that more like a case study, and this a little bit closer to something that would be more a hybrid of qualitative and quantitative.
What were the most important similarities that you found?
Well, the willingness to disbelieve vulnerabilities, because that's so counterintuitive. It's shocking to find it. And also this real belief that exploits the concern about escalation, about cyber escalation, even in the face of disbelief about vulnerabilities. That dissonance shows up in the games. It also shows up in the work I did with Sarah Krebs. And it increasingly shows up in some of the larger and empirical work that people are doing about cyber operations and crisis escalation. So that is a similarity. Now, what is different is that the players that I played in the classified game were extraordinary elites, and they were strategic policy experts. So they understood the importance of nuclear alert, for example. And decisions that they made about nuclear alert and the implications of cyber attacks on nuclear stability were much more nuanced than the vast majority of my games. Now, I will say this: the declassified Stratcom games are actually like too expert, because as we've seen, national security cabinets are not necessarily experts. And in some ways, people who have been 4-star generals at Stratcom may or may not be the key decision makers in the room during a crisis. So that's why my games really are focusing on behaviors and generalizability, as opposed to the exquisiteness of particular people's expertise. There's a really great exchange between Stacey Pettyjohn and her RAND colleagues and Andrew Reddy and his Berkeley colleagues about the role of expertise in games and the ability to iterate and do large-in analysis of gaming and whether that is more or less valid. And so that's in a science piece that came out like a year or two ago.
Can I just add one
Yeah,
thing?
sorry.
Lynn, I think you're referring to a very useful for other purposes type of game that was conducted often in the U.S. government about training operators at all levels. And when I go through the archives, I need to be very careful about identifying those games that gave autonomy to the players versus random in the simulation, right? So for the purposes of what Jackie is describing and what I think is useful, those aren't actually war games. Those are like training exercises. As far, I think you were right that no president ever participated in a war game. Schelling makes that claim at least, and I've never found a president to have been involved. And they did that supposedly on purpose because they didn't want the president to telegraph what he would do in a crisis. And just lastly, you're making me think that there is a whole other strand of research here that I think hopefully people will do about just the belief that war games, because they're done in the Pentagon, have an influence on policy. And we actually don't really, I don't think I know, or I think anyone has really tracked well when war games have been influential even though they're supposedly, we spend a lot of money paying the RAND Corporation to run them all the time.
Yeah, and we've been
We've
been talking about strategic games that are about crisis-making decisions, but there's a slew. In fact, most games are actually at the operational level of war, which brings a whole different set of considerations about expertise, generalizability, realism. But I actually think the operational games are more useful to test inadvertent escalation.
Neat. So just one more anecdote. The example everybody goes to is War Plan Orange and how gaming in the interwar period
Naval War
allowed
College.
the United States to game everything except kamikaze pilots is what they claim. They gamed it all ahead of time and they knew exactly how to win the war.
Yeah, that's why you have to continue to fund Naval War College.
Right. Yeah, so rah Naval War College, but they were finding in games for years that the Mahanian strategy was flawed long before anything changed in the war plan, right? So it probably had very little to do with revelations in war games, why the war plan changed when it did.
Yeah.
Anyway, I work on that. It's on the side.
Okay, Sandyar, we have over here. Go ahead.
Right. Thanks so much, Jackie. I'm Sandyar Mir, postdoc here at CSAC. Was sort of inspired by this conversation. I mean, given that the epistemic standards are sort of still nascent in development, and seems like all of you are sort of trying to think about systematic sources of bias in this work. How should we qualify the policy implications that are produced from this work? What are the caveats, and what are the limits here? Not that the policy process is driven by evidence and theory, if I believe all of these people, but
that's a really good question. A few months ago, I was at a Cyber Command strategy event, and I found myself in a rare moment where everything my research said supported what Cyber Command already wanted to do. So I had found that my research found very little evidence for escalation from cyber attacks. And it's an interesting place to be as an academic, because in some ways, when your prescriptions support what the institution already wants to do, you need to be much more cognizant of the caveats of your research. We talk a lot about bridging the academic policy divide and about making academic research approachable and relevant. But increasingly, all academic research, you can find academic research support any policy recommendation you want. And so I think it's incumbent on us as researchers to police each other, to find the flaws in each other's work, to hold each other up to rigor, and then to lead with the caveats when we brief policy makers. So if I were briefing this to Stratcom, I would significantly caveat my population, and I would significantly caveat the vulnerability and talk a lot about beliefs and vulnerability, and then focus on areas where I think that in general it could create stability incentives, especially when your research is saying, hey, things are more stable than it has to be, but you have to be very responsible with the work that you're doing. And I think venues like this are really helpful and important for people who are trying to do that policy relevant work, because we will police each other more than the generals would ever police us.
Thank you. My name is Kai. I'm a visitor. I graduated from the business school. So yeah, you talk a lot about the bias between individual decision and group decision. So I was wondering, first of all, to take the US as an example, how is the decision taken? And then in an ideal world where you didn't have any timeline constraint, any budget constraint in your war game, how would you then design it?
So I would love to have more data collection mechanisms. In the survey, we asked people to identify the way their group functioned. And I asked, did one personality dominate? Was it very collaborative? Was it difficult to come to consensus? There were like 4 or 5 that were pretty standard. And everybody said we were collaborative. I was like, You know, when you get to that survey, you've designed a survey and you get to the answers and you're like, shoot, that was a throwaway. Like they all chose the easy answer. So I would like to find ways to measure group dynamics. One thing that we're doing, so we're running this game at MIT in January with the Executive MBA program with their Innovation Institute. And what the Innovation Institute has brought to us is this little lapel pen that they put on that measures how much people speak. And so they've used it in the past to measure gender dynamics in groups, but we're hopefully going to be able to use it in the game to try and find a quantitative way to measure group dynamics, and then we can analyze those set of games with how that group dynamic affected the overall outcome. But if I had all the money in the world, I would have designed more data collection mechanisms to capture the role of group dynamics.
Can I ask you a question on group dynamics to follow that? Like, have you considered asking people, like giving the scenario, doing an individual survey, then running the game, and then doing the same survey to see whether the group dynamics changed people's opinion? Because my sense is that the reason why war games are better than surveys for this is that these decisions aren't individual decisions. Yeah. These decisions are group decisions, and they involve deliberation. Even the conference call with the president is a deliberation, right? So, and surveys don't capture that. Yeah. But you kind of need a before and after shot, right? To see whether the group dynamics change people. Yeah. So one of the things that we tried to do in this survey was ask when their views differed from the group to try and capture that. And that's something that we haven't completely pulled all the data out yet. But something that seems, I was talking to Sarah Krebs recently, and the initial data that she's done with her undergraduates is the outcome variables are very similar to the outcomes that we have with our experts. And we're like, well, shoot, like if it's the same, we could just run it, you know, with undergrads till the cows come home. But what seems to be different is that the individual propensities, at least for the undergraduates, are further to the extremes. But when put in a group, it tends to coalesce to an average or a mean, right? And so the mean, the outcome, can be relatively similar, but you actually have much higher variance in the individual level behaviors if they were not in a group. Okay. This gentleman here, and then Scott gets the second bite of the apple on the last word. So,
I'd wonder whether you did some control experiment in an abstract sense so that you hid the word cyber and the word nuclear, and the participant would use abstract names without any knowledge that whatever they play came from nuclear and cyber. And maybe if you did that, maybe subtract the result in the sense that you get just people's perception and what they think they know, independent of the scenario you explained to them in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in that case, a survey might be useful. And then for me, I actually am really interested in the biases that they bring in about nuclear and cyber. So I don't want it clean. I want it messy. I want to know all the baggage that they're bringing to the game. So for me, I like those are biases that I'm collecting on, and less that I'm worried about substantively skewing the outcomes.
But if you want it really messy, you have to subtract the clean from what you got. Separate.
Thank you.
Scott, last question.
So among the many things that I thought was really interesting about Reed's international security article on exercises or on war games was this, what he called the conformity phenomenon. That is, sometimes people voted to do things not because they had really calculated whether this was in the national interest, whether it's a smart thing to do, but because that's what they thought their leaders had hinted that they should do.
Yeah.
Right?
Follow the lead.
Yeah.
And
That's true.
therefore, I would think that when people are discussing why they did what they did, I'd want to know whether there's evidence that somebody said, oh, I read the NPR and it said that we should use nuclear weapons if somebody attacks a cyber against our command and control. Or if they did not reference that. Because to me, that conformity phenomenon may actually be much higher in the experts. Among non. We assume that experts make better decisions because they have more expertise, but it could be that they make worse decisions because they're conforming with what they think their leaders want them to do.
Yeah, and I think we would be really I have a sample of individuals who are kind of mid, like 04 to 07 military officers, where I think that would be like, that would be the ideal sample for testing, for looking. So I'll have to pull out, that's a really good point. I'm gonna pull out some of those groups and look at whether they talk about it in their surveys or in the facilitator notes, because that's a really good point. Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking Jackie Schneider.